Unlike hemispatial neglect, it's likely that some of the students in your class may have been diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD for short. So if you're going to talk about ADHD in class, you obviously want to be mindful of the way you present it and make sure that you aren't contributing to feelings of stigma associated with diagnosis of mental illness. In fact, this could be a great opportunity to talk about the statistical realities behind headline results across many fields of science, and things that are important to keep in mind whenever you're interpreting these findings. In particular, when people hear a result like Group X has a larger prefrontal cortex or Group X performs better on attention tasks, what they often imagine is something like this. That is, that everyone or almost everyone in Group X is better at this task than everyone in the other group. But these descriptions of results are almost always describing instead a small shift in the mean of largely overlapping distributions, as shown in this image. So although there is a statistically significant difference in the average score, the probability that one randomly chosen person from Group X scores higher than one randomly chosen person from Group Y could actually be only slightly better than 50-50. Of course, the exact numbers are going to depend on the shape of these distributions and exactly how far apart the means are. So, getting back to ADHD. First, let's note that there's no performance on a test in the laboratory, there's no genetic test, and there's no measurement of brain volume or activity that can be used to diagnose ADHD. ADHD diagnosis is based on a number of clinical criteria displayed over time in multiple environments, and critically on the question of whether these symptoms interfere with or reduce the quality of social, school, or work functioning, so having an impact on function in everyday life. For example, some of the possible symptoms of inattention is often easily distracted and often has trouble holding attention on tasks or play activities. Some potential symptoms of hyperactivity or impulsivity include often fidgets with or taps hands or feet or squirms in seat, and often talks excessively. Diagnosis can be primarily inattentive, primarily hyperactive impulsive, or combined. Keeping in mind the caveats of highly overlapping distributions that we just discussed, there have been some findings regarding ADHD attentional performance and brain structure. As you would expect, given the name attention deficit, on average, ADHD patients have impaired performance on sustained attention tasks. They also show, again, on average, reduced working memory capacity, reduced ability to inhibit motor plans, and less risk aversion. In the brain of ADHD patients, the prefrontal cortex is slightly smaller and reaches peak volume at a later age. The white matter tracts connecting the prefrontal cortex to other areas are smaller, and the functional connectivity between prefrontal cortex and other areas is lower. All of these findings are broadly consistent with the idea that the prefrontal cortex is going to have less ability to control activity elsewhere in the brain. And prefrontal cortex isn't the only area where differences are seen. The cerebellum and parietal cortex are also smaller, while several sensory areas are larger, and the basal ganglia has a smaller reward response in ADHD patients. The cause of ADHD is not known, although both genetic and environmental risk factors have been identified. But the mechanisms of action of medications used to treat the symptoms have heavily informed hypotheses as to the underlying cause of the disease. Common pharmacological treatments for ADHD include methylphenidate, also known as Ritalin, amphetamine, marketed as Adderall, atomoxetine, and guanfacine. What these pharmaceuticals all have in common is targeting the pathway of a neurotransmitter called norepinephrine, with or without additional effects on dopamine signaling. By slowing down the clearance of these neurotransmitters from synapses, these drugs should effectively increase the level of signaling in pathways using those neurotransmitters. This suggests that a natural deficiency in this neurotransmitter, or the activity it drives in neurons, could be responsible for the original symptoms. However, directly measuring neurotransmitter levels in synapses to test this hypothesis isn't possible in humans. And of course, there are many neural circuits using norepinephrine and dopamine throughout the brain, not all of which may be related to the symptoms of ADHD. In some cases, these drugs can also improve the performance of neurotypical volunteers on laboratory tasks, which then raises the question of whether these drugs are targeting an underlying deficit or merely compensating by boosting attentional performance through alternative means. A better understanding of exactly which circuits are altered in different subtypes of ADHD and ways to target manipulations specifically to those pathways would likely improve treatment efficacy and specificity.